Hi, I'm Preti Taneja. I'm a writer and professor of world literature and creative writing at Newcastle University, and you are watching DESIblitz.com.
DESIblitz.com.
My parents came to the UK in the 1960s, and I was born here. I grew up here. They really put a lot of emphasis on reading and lots of different kinds of stories from all over the world when we were children. So the house was full of books, and there was like big stress on if you did well, then you got a book. If you needed punishing, then you had to go read a book. And it was like a lot of like reading influence. So I always loved that aspect. But the second part is that my mum was a really incredible cook, like a lot of South Asian women are. And she was also very entrepreneurial. So in the late 70s and 80s, she started writing cookery books about Indian food. And she published 7 or 8 books across the 80s, 70s and 80s. And I think she was one of the first kind of women from South Asian backgrounds to write and publish. So some of my earliest memories of her are of her writing. Like the cooking part kind of went over my head a bit, but the writing part really stuck. And so because she was always my role model, I wanted to be a writer just like her. Everything. Like she would go on trips to India and she would come back with Amar Chitrakatha comics. So she wanted us to learn mythology and stories. So we had like the CR version of the Mahabharata, which all Indian children have, like 10 million copies sold, in the Ramayana and so on. But also she brought back feminist books from India. So stories written by women, about women, fiction, non-fiction. And at the same time, obviously, there was all of the English stories that we were getting at school, the Shakespeare and the Dickens and the, we had a copy, a very first edition of Midnight's Children, because it was a big deal that, an Indian writer or South Asian origin writer had written a book that was so successful. And I've got to give my dad some credit too. So, he was the one who basically was just like, it's through this that you're going to find your own voice. There's such a gap between those of us who want to write and actually becoming published. And I think there's a real, we have to be realistic about the cultural marketplace in this country, where it's really, really tough for writers of colour to find a publisher, an agent, and go through that process. And it isn't because we aren't writing, and it isn't because we aren't writing well or writing interesting things. It's just because the market doesn't want to make space for us on the same level as other writers from white backgrounds, right? So often you'll find that writers of colour start off in small presses, which are doing some really interesting and radical and different work. And there's absolutely no shame in that. It doesn't mean that the work isn't as good as something that's published by a big house. It just means that those are the editors who have the guts to do something and take you on, take a book on, and see the value in publishing you and supporting your career. And that's kind of what happened to me. So I wrote my first novel as part of a course in creative writing, a PhD, where you get to spend 3 years writing a novel, and you also write some critical work around it, and you end up with a doctorate at the end. And it's a fantastic way if you go into it as a mature student like I did. So I was about 32 when I first started that process, because I'd taken a long time to fulfill my family obligations, and I had to get a job and I had to work full time, and it took me ages to think I could definitely, even though I really want to be a writer, now I'm going to see if I can get published. I sort of gave myself permission, I enrolled on this course as a mature student and wrote the novel, tried to send it out through an agent who was really supportive of it, but publishing was just like, no. And after about 4 years of me just feeling like it was all me, it suddenly began to dawn on me that actually this was part of a bigger structural problem. And in lots of ways, I've got, the time that was happening in to thank for that, because Nikesh Shukla was publishing Good Immigrant, and he was beginning to open up this huge conversation nationally about this structural discrimination. And I was able to then put my experience in a wider context, which helped me to keep writing, because I knew suddenly it wasn't me. The way you get rejected, it's always like, oh, it's not quite for us, or we didn't fall in love with it, or whatever. And you think, oh, it's because I can't do this. You internalize that message, but it's really important not to, because as long as you keep working at your craft and sending your work out, you will find someone who thinks yes. And that eventually happened to me with a small press based in Norwich, and the rest is history. If you want to work in publishing, some things have changed for the better. Like now, internships are paid and they have to go through a formal application process often. Whereas when I was coming up in the 90s, there was definitely a sense that you had to know someone. And there was a sort of nepotistic element to it, which meant that if you knew someone in publishing, you could get in that way. And if you come from a second generation South Asian community, how are you going to know anyone in elite publishing? Because you've never had the time to put down the routes that are going to take you to the right schools or whatever. And now there's an open application form, and you can't afford to go and do work experience somewhere where you're going to might meet people if it's not paid. How can someone who grows up outside London afford to go and do work experience in London which is not paid? It's impossible. Who are you going to live? How are you going to eat? I think those things are changing, and I think there's more attention on schemes that are going to help kids from minoritized backgrounds into that world. But it's not enough to have access schemes that get you in the door, because once you're in, then what? It's a different language, different culture of behaviour, different codes that you don't know. So then publishing then has to work hard to make sure that those people do not drop out after a year or 18 months because they just don't feel welcome. It's different at every university and in every town, but I don't think that a lot of South Asian kids look at Newcastle University yet and say that's a place where I would feel at home. And I hope that me being there is going to help to change that, along with other colleagues who are doing really good work about, Black and Asian stories and filmmaking, screenwriting. Our professor, our chancellor is Imtiaz Dharka, and she's obviously one of the UK's and the world's great poets. There has to be an attitude change from both sides to employ more diverse staff, to celebrate and support more diverse storytelling in the student body, to give those scholarships so that people feel like they can afford to come to university with us. And then there also has to be like a marketing drive to make sure that kids feel like, yes, this is somewhere I could go and thrive. And London might be a comfort zone, but this is exciting as well, and there's some opportunities here. When I was growing up, my mum and my aunts obviously used to tell us the stories of partition, which were their own stories. So my grandparents on both sides, they were partition refugees. They moved from Lahore and places that are now in Pakistan to Delhi. And my mum was born in December 1947, so she was actually a migratory baby. My grandmother never went back. They never went back to Pakistan because the line was drawn and that was it. And the same with my dad. So, but this was not something that we ever really talked about in school. And it wasn't in history, it wasn't in English, it wasn't in geography. And then when I was about 16, 17, we did King Lear for A-levels. I had a brilliant teacher, but I just saw an Indian story. And the first time I'd ever seen like partition discussed, and it was Shakespeare, and I was like, whoa, this play is about the division of a kingdom and lines drawn on a map, and a father sort of making his daughters perform for the public, which is kind of normal in Asian households, right? Like, do your 10 times table for the dinner guests or whatever it is, show how clever you are. Love on demand and that. So there were lots of resonances. It really spoke to me as an Indian story. The thing they really are important for is it helps the book find more readers. So if you do get that kind of critical attention or you win a prize, it just means that more readers might hear about it, and it generates its own momentum, I mean, otherwise, like, small press distribution numbers for a print run start at like 3,000 books, which is not very many at the end of the day. That's not going to see you like stacked in Waterstone's front table across the country. It's going to be one book in every shop, maybe. What can we do better is just be more ourselves. Don't think about impressing some editor that you'll might never meet. Just be yourself, and be it definitely in your writing, as definitely as you possibly can. And then make that writing as strong as it possibly can be in its own groundedness. If you want to write in 2 languages because you grew up speaking 2 languages and it fits the story you're telling, just do it. Don't italicize your Hindi or Punjabi or your Potwari or your, Urdu words if your characters all know that what those words mean, right? Why would you italicize and foreignize things for a white readership? That's, just be yourself as a writer on the page. That's it. Like, have an honest relationship with your own creativity and don't try and please the crowd. That's what we can do better. And in terms of what the other side can do better, that's on them. We can't teach them that. We can make our own worlds.
DESIblitz.com